Wait a second. In Matthew, they flee to Egypt. How do they go home 40 days later in Luke if they're on their way to Egypt? And they stay in Egypt until Herod dies. And then they can't come back to Judea because the next ruler is worse than Herod. And so this is months and months, years, I don't know, but Luke says they went back 40 days later. How can that possibly be right? They can't both be right. If Jesus spent his ministry talking about himself as a divine being, calling himself God, if you knew that, wouldn't you want to mention that part? These 6 sources don't even mention it? That seems to me odd. I think John is not reporting what Jesus really said. In short, are the Gospels historically reliable? Heard anybody? I don't think so. I'm here as a historian who's been very interested in this subject for a very, very long time, for my entire adult life. So this is the topic. Are the Gospels... it's a little bit confusing because we're asking about the reliable, but the resolution is, are they unreliable? So I'm debating that they are unreliable. Okay, so anyway, I want to talk about my key terms. The key terms in this resolution, as far as I'm concerned, are first, historically reliable. In this debate, I will not be talking about whether they are religiously, theologically reliable. I'm not talking about whether they're reliable about what you ought to believe about God or Christ or anything else. I'm interested in the historical question. Do they describe what actually happened? Are they reliable? And when I say reliable, do I mean, are they entirely reliable, mainly reliable, partially reliable, not at all reliable? I think these are, there are different ways to approach this. My questions are actually fairly simple. They are, if the Gospels say something happened, did it happen? If they say that Jesus said something, did he say it? If they say that Jesus did something, did he do it? And so those are the questions I want to pursue with you. And I'll start by telling you my basic view of the matter. My basic view is that the Gospels do contain significant historical information. I'm not a complete skeptic. I think that the Gospels describe the man Jesus as a Jewish preacher in Galilee who talked about the coming kingdom of God, and that he gathered disciples, and he went to Jerusalem the last week of his life during a Passover feast, and was turned over to the authorities and was crucified. So, I mean, the basic story, I think, is absolutely reliable in the Gospels. But I think, in addition to the broad outlines of the things that Jesus did, said, and experienced, there are large numbers of inconsistencies, contradictions, non-historical accounts that make these Gospels unreliable in many, many ways. There are lots of details that are unreliable, I think, in the Gospels, but I'm not going to focus on the details because they might be interesting if you really want every single word to be right. I'm interested in the major ways for this debate that the Gospels seem to me to be unreliable, involving 3 big issues that I'll try to address in my time. Issues connected with Jesus' birth, Jesus' resurrection, and Jesus' teaching or preaching. Okay, so that's what I'll be talking about, those 3 areas. And I'm going to start with the birth. Jesus was born to the Virgin in Bethlehem. What are our sources of information for the birth of Jesus? Just in the New Testament. We don't have sources from outside the New Testament that are going to help us much for any of this material. We're restricted to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And what are our sources of information about Jesus' birth just in the New Testament? Well, we have an account of Jesus' birth in the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 1 and 2. We have an account in Luke, chapter 1 and 2. Those are the only passages in the entire New Testament that talk about Jesus' birth in Bethlehem to a virgin. That's interesting. Matthew and Luke don't talk about the birth outside of those first 2 chapters. They don't refer back to it. And what about other sources in the New Testament? They don't mention it. The virgin birth, of course, is a huge doctrine in the history of Christianity. In my part of the world, in the American South, Protestant evangelicals often say that if you don't believe in the virgin birth, you can't be a Christian. Why aren't there other parts of the New Testament that even talk about it. It's an interesting question that I think a lot of people haven't thought about. Why isn't there any account of Jesus' birth in our first gospel, the Gospel of Mark? Why isn't there one in the Gospel of John? Why doesn't he say anything about Jesus being born of a virgin? What about the Apostle Paul? Why doesn't he talk about the virgin birth? There are 13 letters that claim to be written by Paul. There's not a word about the virgin birth. There are 27 books in the New Testament. 25 of them don't say anything about it. That's interesting. Well, why? The bigger question I'm going to address, though, is how do we explain the differences between the two accounts that we do have? There are lots of differences between these two accounts. People don't realize this because, we hear the Christmas story every year and we sort of smash it all together in our heads. But when you actually read the accounts, it's pretty interesting. Read Matthew's account and just make a list of what happens. Then read Luke's account, make a list of what happens, and then compare your two lists. There are lots of differences. Many of them may not matter to you. Matthew has the wise men coming visit Jesus. Luke has the shepherds. Matthew has Jesus' family escaping to Egypt. Luke has the presentation at the temple and the circumcision. These are differences, but they're just different. That doesn't mean they're contradictory. There are some potential problems, though. Some potential contradictions that I think actually are real contradictions. They involve Bethlehem and Nazareth. The similarity. Matthew and Luke both agree that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but that he was raised in Nazareth. Nazareth is about 100 miles, 80 miles, 100 miles north of Bethlehem. Discrepancies in these two accounts. This one I'm not going to go into, but if you want to look for yourself, just look at the two genealogies. One in Matthew chapter 1 and the other in Luke chapter 3. And ask yourself, who actually was Jesus' grandfather? Was it Jacob or Heli? And who was his great-grandfather and his great-great-grandfather? The different genealogies all the way back to David. Is Jesus descended from David's son Solomon or David's son Nathan? Depends which one you read. Well, that's interesting. Just look for yourself and you'll see. I'm more interested in the question of why Bethlehem and why Nazareth, according to these two accounts. So here's how it works. Matthew chapters 1 and 2. In the Gospel of Matthew, Joseph and Mary start out in Bethlehem. Mary gives birth in Bethlehem, and there's a star that is leading the wise men to Jesus. The wise men are coming from the east, and they follow the star, and the star apparently stops over Jerusalem. They go into Jerusalem and ask, where is the King of the Jews to be born? And the inquiries get to the King Herod. Herod asks his wise men, and not his scripture scholars, to tell the wise men, and it turns out that the scriptures say that the King of the Jews is to be born in Bethlehem. And so the wise men then follow, the star reappears somehow, and it stops over the house. That's interesting. It stops over the house that Jesus is being born in. How does a star stop over a house exactly? Go out tonight and look up at the stars and tell me, which house is that star over? And it doesn't do much good if it's a comet or a supernova or anything else. So it can't be really a star. It must be something else. But that's fine. What happens, though, is they come in and worship Jesus, and they offer their three gifts. They're going to go home then, and they learn by an angel that they can't go back to Jerusalem to tell Herod because he's out to kill the child. And so they go some other way, and Herod sends out the troops to kill.
The virgin birth is treated like a core Christian belief, but the New Testament itself barely supports it. Mark says nothing, John says nothing, Paul says nothing. That matters because Paul's letters are earlier than the Gospels. Only Matthew and Luke mention it, and even they don't agree on key details. Matthew says Jesus' grandfather was Jacob, while Luke says it was Heli. Matthew traces Jesus through Solomon. Luke traces him through Nathan. If this was real history, the basic family line should not collapse this fast.
The child. They kill all the children. The troops kill all the male children in Bethlehem, the slaughter of the innocents. That, by the way, is a very interesting story. There's no record of that happening in any ancient document other than this. You would think that would be in the newspaper. Joseph and Mary learn that the Herod's after the child, and so they escape to Egypt. They get out of there to escape Herod, and they go to Egypt. And of course, you know, if you're going to Egypt from Bethlehem, you got to walk. I mean, you can't take a train, and so it takes a while to get there. And they're in Egypt until Herod dies. And when Herod dies, they start to return, but they realize they can't go back to Judea, where Bethlehem is, in the south of what we think of as Israel. And so they relocate to Nazareth. And that's why Jesus is born in Bethlehem and raised in Nazareth, in Matthew. Luke has a very different account. In Luke, Joseph and Mary start in Nazareth. That's where they're from. And it turns out there's a worldwide census. The Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus has decided that the entire world has to register for a census, and so everybody has to go to their ancestral home. Joseph has to go to Bethlehem to register for the census because he's from the lineage of King David. And King David came from Bethlehem. Now, this is a very weird phenomenon just on the surface of it. How is it that everybody... What? I mean, Joseph was 1,000 years after David. Everybody's going to where their ancestors were 1,000 years earlier to register for a census? According to Luke, it's the census of the entire world. Well, that can't be right. It must be the Roman Empire. Okay, the entire Roman Empire. Everybody's going to their ancestral home from 1,000 years earlier? How does that work? I mean, suppose the Democrats just really take over everything next time, and they decide, you know, we all need to register for a tax, because you know how much they like to tax people, and so, you know, they got to go register for, and you've got to go to register for this tax. You've got to go to where your ancestors came from 1,000 years ago. Where are you going to go? Really? And the entire population's doing this, and it doesn't get reported in the newspaper? There is no record of this anywhere, except for Luke. Well, Mary gives birth in Bethlehem, and 8 days later, Jesus is circumcised, and then 32 days after that, they go to the temple to present a sacrifice as commanded in the book of Leviticus, chapter 12. So it's 40 days later, and then after that, 40 days after birth, Mary gives her offering, and then they return home to Nazareth. Wait a second. In Matthew, they flee to Egypt. How do they go home 40 days later in Luke if they're on their way to Egypt? And they stay in Egypt until Herod dies. And then they can't come back to Judea because the next ruler is worse than Herod. And so this is months and months, years, I don't know. But Luke says they went back 40 days later. How can that possibly be right? They can't both be right. The deal is that either one of them is right and the other is wrong and therefore unreliable, or they're both wrong and therefore both unreliable. They both can't be right. They can't be right. Let's talk about the resurrection. We have 4 accounts of the resurrection, and there's some broad similarities. Jesus dies. On the third, he's buried. Third day, women go to the tomb, find it empty, learn that he's been raised from the dead. Basic similarities. But lots of differences. There are lots of minor discrepancies, and some of them matter. To illustrate, how do the disciples of Jesus learn that he's been raised from the dead? In each gospel. Simply read them yourselves, you'll see. In the Gospel of Mark, we're explicitly told that the women go to the tomb, they learn that he's been raised from the dead. They are told to go tell his disciples that he's been raised and he will meet them in Galilee. And the women fled from the tomb, and they didn't say anything to anyone because they were afraid. Period. The gospel stops there. They didn't tell anyone. That's the end of the Gospel of Mark. In Matthew, I should have put Matthew here. Matthew, Luke, and John, the women go to the tomb. They hear that Jesus has been raised. They're supposed to go tell the disciples. And they go right away and they tell. Well, which is it? Where do the disciples go if they go anywhere? Mark and Matthew, Mark presupposes that they're supposed to go to Galilee. Matthew says They go to Galilee, and that's where they meet Jesus. But in Luke, the women hear about Jesus being raised, and then Jesus appears to two followers the same day, we're told. The women go tell the disciples, and while they're talking to the disciples, Jesus shows up on the same day, and then he takes them out, and he tells them, don't leave Jerusalem in the south. Don't leave Jerusalem. Stay in Jerusalem until you receive the Spirit. When you get to the next book written by the same author, Acts, they're in Jerusalem 40 days later. And they stay in Jerusalem after that. Jesus appears to them in Jerusalem and tells them not to leave, and they don't leave for months. In Matthew, they go straight to Galilee. How could it be both? It can't be both. Where do they see Jesus? Do they see Jesus anywhere? Not in Mark. In Mark, the women don't even tell anybody. In Matthew, they see Jesus only in Galilee. They make a trip up to Galilee, they go up to Galilee, they're in Galilee. They see Jesus, and then he leaves them. In Luke, however, they see him only in Jerusalem, and Jesus tells them, don't leave Jerusalem, and they stay in Jerusalem. They see Jesus, and then he ascends to heaven. Well, how can they... Just read them yourself. They differ from each other in a way that can't be reconciled. How can all of these accounts be right? What about Jesus preaching? There are lots of things we could say about Jesus' message. Because of the short amount of time, I just want to talk about what Jesus said about himself.
Matthew says the family runs to Egypt because Herod is killing children. Luke says they calmly stay, follow Jewish law, go to the temple after 40 days, then return to Nazareth. Those timelines do not fit. Matthew's massacre has no outside historical record, even though Herod's crimes were written about by Josephus. Luke's census also makes no sense. Rome did not make people travel to an ancestor's town from 1,000 years earlier. That sounds like theology forcing Jesus into Bethlehem, not history.
What does Jesus teach about himself in the various Gospels? Well, I'll start with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. As you know, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are, as you may know, they're very common. They have a lot in common, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So much in common that they're usually called the synoptic Gospels. And synoptic means you can see them together. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so similar. They tell so many of the same stories, usually in the same sequence, first this, and this, and this, and this, and often in the same word for word the same, that you can put them in columns next to each other and just read and compare them to each other because they're so similar, and John is very different. But the difference is really quite striking when it comes to Jesus' message in particular. What does Jesus preach about in the synoptic Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Well, the dominant theme, by far, you'll see if you just read them, just by far, is Jesus preaches about God and his kingdom. God's kingdom is soon to arrive on earth. You need to repent and prepare for it. The very first recorded words of Jesus are in Mark chapter 1, verse 15. The time has been fulfilled. The kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe the good news. God's kingdom is almost here. Get ready for it. And throughout the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he's telling people how to get ready for it. Turn back to God. Obey God. Love one another. Love God. Because the kingdom's coming. What does Jesus say about himself in these Gospels? He does say that he has to go to Jerusalem and be rejected and executed, and that he will rise from the dead. What does he say about his personal identity in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? About coming down from heaven, or being a divine being, or being... What does he say about it? Nothing. He will, if somebody calls him the Messiah, he'll tacitly agree to it, or at the end, actually agree to it. He'll agree he's the Messiah. He will, and so there are things, but in terms of what does he say about himself, so people can say, well, who are you? Well, you know, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's not something he talks about. What about the Gospel of John? In the Gospel of John, that's all he talks about. He doesn't talk about God and his coming kingdom. in the Gospel of John. Jesus talks about who he is, his identity. For example, the I am sayings in the Gospel of John. These are the most distinctive sayings of the Gospel of John, where Jesus identifies himself. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus talks about himself as the one who has come from the Father to earth to reveal the truth, so people can know the truth about him, so that they can have eternal life. That's the entire thing in the Gospel of John. And sometimes these I am sayings are really quite striking, because sometimes he simply says, I am. In the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus, chapter 3, when Moses asks God, what is your name? God says, I am. Tell them that I am has sent you. That's the name of God. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. Whoa. He's claiming to be God. And the Jewish opponents know that. They take up stones to stone him to death. These are pretty interesting claims. One place Jesus says, John 10:30, the Father and I are one. They pick up stones again. Chapter 14, Philip says, Lord, show us the Father. Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Jesus is claiming to be God in John, and he never claims that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That is interesting. Is this a contradiction? No, this is not a contradiction. He might have said something, said different things at different times. But it doesn't seem to me to make any sense. Scholars for a long time have recognized that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are based on earlier sources that provide these Gospels with their material. Mark itself was probably copied by Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke had some other source. You might have heard of a source called Q. It's a hypothetical source, but it appears to be a source used by Matthew and Luke for many of their sayings of Jesus, like the Lord's Prayer, for example, or the Beatitudes. That they're not in Mark, but they're in Matthew and Luke. They had a source, Q. Matthew has some of his own stories, the wise men. And so that's a separate source. They call it M for Matthew's source. Luke had a separate source for his stories, like the Good Samaritan, call it L. None of these sources has Jesus talk about himself or call himself God. Mark, Q, M, L, Matthew, Luke. These are earlier than John. If Jesus spent his ministry talking about himself as a divine being, calling himself God, if you knew that, wouldn't you want to mention that part? These 6 sources don't even mention it? That seems to me odd. I think John is not reporting what Jesus really said. In short, are the Gospels historically reliable? I don't think so. Thank you.
The problem gets even worse with Jesus' own identity. In Mark, Matthew, and Luke, Jesus mostly preaches about God's kingdom coming soon. Mark 1:15 says, "The kingdom of God is at hand." But in John, Jesus suddenly talks like God himself. I am. Before Abraham was, I am. And the Father and I are one. That is a massive shift. If Jesus openly claimed to be God, the earlier gospel sources should not be silent about it. This looks like later theology being placed into Jesus' mouth.
Jimmy Aiken, you have 20 minutes for your opening statement.
Wait for the PowerPoint to switch over. There we go. Okay. I feel bad for Bart because I didn't realize we were going to have the screen way over there. So I'm going to angle my laptop so you can follow along.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay. So first of all, thank you everybody for coming. Hope you're having a great evening, and I hope to make it greater if possible. I want to apologize for that because that's kind of a spoiler. I probably should have given you a spoiler warning first, but it is what we're debating tonight. And Bart has made a few specific challenges to places in the Gospels where he thinks they contain errors or at least things that are odd. And I'll be happy to talk about those later, like in our cross-examination period or in the audience question period. But what I need to do right now is give you a sketch of the big picture. So as Cy mentioned, our debate resolution is that the Gospels are historically unreliable. And you might wonder why put it that way. Well, normally what will happen, at least very frequently what will happen in my experience, is skeptics will come to believers and demand that they prove the Gospels are reliable. Why should I believe those Gospels are reliable? But I think it's healthy to look at questions from both perspectives. And so I think it's healthy, once in a while at least, to have skeptics bear the burden of proof and show why a believer should say that the Gospels are unreliable. So that's what we're doing tonight. Now, in a debate, at least a formal one like this, the person who agrees with the resolution has the burden of proof. So Bart agrees that the Gospels are unreliable, and so Bart must show tonight that the Gospels are unreliable. I only have to show that Bart hasn't proven his case. We need to talk for a moment about the difference between reliability and inerrancy. Reliability is something we all have a gut sense of. You know, when something is reliable, it means it works, at least most of the time. But what about inerrancy? It's kind of an unfamiliar term to some folks, but it means if a source is inerrant, it means that it contains no errors. It's 100% accurate. In fundamentalist Christianity, they have a particular interpretation of inerrancy that's very common that would say the Gospels are inerrant in such a way that they, for example, have a word-for-word transcript of everything that Jesus says is exactly, there's no paraphrasing going on, and not only Jesus, but everyone who talks to Jesus, or everyone who says anything at all in the Gospels, we always have a word-for-word transcript, and that's how they understand inerrancy. But there are more nuanced interpretations of inerrancy, and the Catholic Church has one. If you want to read about it, at least at a kind of top level, you could go to sections 11 to 13 of the Vatican II document Dei Verbum. But we've got a question. How could we verify if the Gospels were inerrant? I mean, how would you determine that? Well, for most Christians, it's a matter of faith. You know, we've seen evidence that leads us to believe in the Christian faith, and we're taught as part of the Christian faith that the Gospels are inerrant, and so we accept that. But we're not here to debate faith tonight. As Bart said, we're looking at the Gospels from a historical perspective and what a historian could make of them. Well, from a historical perspective, if you wanted to verify that the Gospels are 100% accurate in everything they say, you'd have to go back in time and check to see if every claim can be verified with your own eyes. But without a time machine, you won't be able to do that. And so we're not debating inerrancy tonight. All we're debating is reliability. And reliability is a spectrum. You can have some sources that are 100% accurate, which would make them inerrant, or you could have some sources that are 100% inaccurate. Nothing they say is right. But our question is not a spectrum question. We're asking a yes or no question. Are the Gospels reliable or are they unreliable? So how would we determine that, given that reliability is a spectrum? I mean, where would you draw the line on that spectrum and say, okay, if a document gets up to this point or higher, it's reliable, but if it's below this point, we're going to call it unreliable? Well, one place you could draw the line is right at the top, at the 100% level, and say, okay, unless a document is inerrant, unless it's 100% right on everything, we're going to say it's unreliable. But that's not how we use the word reliable in ordinary life. I mean, for example, most people have friends. I know I do. I assume Bart does. And we have friends that we would consider reliable. You know, they tell us what they think, they help us when we're in trouble, they show up for appointments, you know, they're reliable friends. But we don't, if a friend makes just one mistake, say, oh, that friend is fundamentally unreliable. He made one mistake. And so reliability isn't the same thing as inerrancy. So how can we say what it is? Well, if we don't put the line at the top of the spectrum, we might put it somewhere else, like say at the 50% level. You know, at that level you could say, well, if it's above that, it's right most of the time, and so it's reliable most of the time. If it's below that level, it's fundamentally unreliable. Or you might say, I want it to be higher than that. I mean, I wouldn't consider a friend who's reliable half the time to be a really reliable friend. So you might put it elsewhere. You might say, put it at the 75% level or at some other level. But there's a problem, because as we noted, if you want to assign a percentage like 100% to the reliability of a document from a historical perspective rather than a faith perspective, you're going to need a time machine. No time machine means no way to go back and check out all these claims, and thus there's no way to establish some percentage and say, well, if it meets this, then it's reliable. So we can't use percentages as a way of measuring reliability. We have to do something else. So what can we do? Well, I would note that documents tend to make different kinds of claims. Some of them are major claims, which deal with the most important facts and themes and events that the document discusses. Some of them are intermediate claims, which are not the most important, but still important facts, themes, and events. And then there are lesser claims, like individual details and minor themes and events. And I would propose, in light of that, that a source may be judged historically reliable if we can verify many of its major claims, many of its intermediate claims, and many of its lesser claims. So if we can check it out and show, wow, a bunch of its major claims and intermediate claims and lesser claims, they're accurate, then we can judge it to be historically reliable. Until we've seen enough errors to counterbalance this.
A major weakness in apologetics is lowering the standard of evidence when it comes to religious claims. Nobody would accept miracle stories from other religions just because some locations or historical figures mentioned in the story were real. A document can contain accurate names, cities, and customs while still making false supernatural claims. Historians do not verify resurrection stories by counting small details that happen to be correct. The real question is whether the extraordinary claims are supported by extraordinary evidence. So far, Christianity has not met that standard. Faith may accept those claims, but history requires much stronger proof.
So if you see a picture like this, with lots of verified claims on the major, intermediate, and minor levels, then you can judge that document historically reliable. Now, of course, you need to understand how to read the document. Like if it's an ancient document, you need to know how ancient sources worked so you can interpret it correctly. And I'll have more to say about that in my second statement. But for the moment, let's look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and see what we can determine about their reliability. Well, here's a list of major claims that the Gospels make. Jesus existed. Jesus was a Jew. He lived in the 1st century in Roman Palestine. He had a reputation as a teacher on both moral and prophetic subjects. He gathered disciples, including an inner circle of 12 disciples. He was crucified, and the man who put him to death, the man who ordered him crucified, was the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. So, how can we evaluate these claims? Well, I'd love to be able to present you with all the evidence I'm aware of, but I've got 11 minutes left in this opening statement. So I'm going to have to do something else. And fortunately, we have with us tonight Bart Ehrman. See, he's right up there. And he's also right here, incarnate, as it were. So what does Bart Ehrman make of these major gospel claims? Well, one thing, as a historian, he's not going to say that a historical document ever gives you absolute certainty about what happened in the past, but it will give you probabilities. And so even though he wouldn't say that we have ontological certitude that certain things happened about Jesus, he will say the Gospels are probably right about some things. In fact, he already said it in his opening statement. And sometimes he'll say they're very, very probably right. So what about that first major gospel claim, that Jesus existed? Well, Bart Ehrman says that's right. In fact, he wrote a book called Did Jesus Exist?, in which he combats mythicists, Jesus mythicists who say Jesus didn't really exist, he was just a myth. Bart wrote an entire book refuting that point of view, and I think he deserves credit. Let's give Bart a big hand of applause.
Thank you.
And this is something that Bart and I agree about. Jesus really existed. High five. Yeah! So, Bart agrees that Jesus existed. What does he think about these other major claims? Well, without making too long of a point of it, he thinks that the Gospels are right when they say Jesus was a Jew who lived in the first century in Palestine, who was a teacher on moral subjects, on prophetic subjects, who gathered disciples, who had an inner circle of 12 disciples, who was crucified, and who was sent to his crucifixion by Pontius Pilate. So Bart agrees on all these major gospel claims. Well, what about intermediate claims, things of a slightly lesser scale in the Gospels? Well, the Gospels say that Jesus lived in the first century, but more specifically, they indicate he was an adult in the AD 20s. Bart Ehrman says that's right. The Gospels indicate Jesus lived in Roman Palestine, but more specifically, they say he came from Nazareth. Bart says that's right. The Gospels say Jesus was connected with John the Baptist. Bart agrees. Jesus was baptized at the beginning of his ministry, according to the Gospels. Bart agrees. John the Baptist was the one who did the baptism, and Bart agrees. What about John the Baptist himself? Well, the Gospels indicate that John preached a message of coming destruction and salvation. Bart says that's right. The Gospels also indicate that Jesus agreed with John the Baptist's message. Bart says that's right too. Jesus not only was a teacher, but one of the ways he taught was in parables, according to the Gospels. Bart says that's right. One of Jesus' major themes in his teaching was the kingdom of God, and Bart said that, in fact, in his opening statement. Jesus believed that he was the king of that coming kingdom, or the Messiah. And Bart says Jesus did believe that. Jesus taught that there was a coming reversal of fortunes where the exalted would be humbled and the humble would be exalted, according to the Gospels and according to Bart Ehrman. Jesus didn't think that you needed to scrupulously observe the Mosaic Law in the way that some thought you did. Bart agrees. Also, Jesus believed that the heart of the Mosaic Law was the love of God and the love of neighbor. Bart signs off on that too. And Jesus believed that the way to attain the kingdom was through love of God and neighbor. Once again, the Gospels and Bart agree. Because Jesus' teachings were different than other Jewish teachers, Jesus was in conflict with them. He also spent much of his preaching ministry in Galilee. But at the end of the ministry, he went to Jerusalem for Passover. And he predicted the destruction of the temple. And he was betrayed to the Jewish authorities. He had a follower named Judas. Judas was the man who betrayed him to the Jewish authorities. The Jewish authorities then handed him over to Pilate, and Pilate had him crucified for calling himself the King of the Jews. On all of these points, the Gospels are probably right, according to Bart Ehrman. So Bart not only agrees that the major claims we covered are accurate, but all of these intermediate ones as well. What about lesser matters of detail, smaller stuff? Well, Jesus, unlike the Pharisees, did not interpret the Sabbath command as strictly. Bart agrees. Jesus did not, unlike the Sadducees, understand the temple rituals and sacrifices the way the temple cult did. Jesus did not think people, unlike the Essenes, did not think people should isolate themselves in order to maintain ritual purity. Jesus said that the kingdom would be brought about by a cosmic judge called the Son of Man. Jesus said that the kingdom of God had already begun, even though it was still coming. Jesus spoke of leaving one's family for the sake of the kingdom. That's an individual saying of Jesus, so it's definitely on the minor scale of things. Jesus privately taught the 12 that he was the Messiah. He did not, however, publicly proclaim that he was the Messiah to Jews in general, at least not till the end. Jesus, and the reason he didn't do that is presumably because Jesus did not understand his kingship as a worldly political one. Bart agrees with that too. The Gospels also preserve Jesus' sayings in the parable of the sheep and the goats. Jesus himself was the one who commissioned the 12, and another individual saying he told the 12, this one's only in Luke, he told the 12 that they would sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Jesus associated with tax collectors and sinners, and religious leaders mocked him as a result. Jesus had conflict with some members of his own family, and some members of his family didn't believe in him during his public ministry. That trip he made to Jerusalem for Passover at the end, that was around AD 30, according to the Gospels and according to Bart Ehrman. He came to Jerusalem, though, not just for Passover, but a week before Passover, according to the Gospels, and Bart says that's probably right. Jesus proclaimed his apocalyptic message at Jerusalem at the end. He objected to the money changing and the selling of animals at the temple, and he, as a result, reacted violently and caused a disturbance in the temple. After the temple incident, Jesus suspected his time was up, but when he was handed over to the Jewish authorities, they didn't try him just according to their own law. They instead handed him over to Pilate, and they didn't have to go far, because the Gospels say, and Bart agrees, that Pontius Pilate was in Jerusalem at the time. As a result, Pilate gave Jesus a brief trial. It did not go on for days or weeks. When asked if he was the king of the Jews, Jesus either answered ambiguously or in the affirmative, according to the Gospels and according to Bart. The man who betrayed Jesus, Judas, died some kind of untimely death, and his death was somehow connected with a field in Jerusalem. And there's more. That's only some of the things that in my reading for the debate, I discovered Bart thinks the Gospels are probably right about.
This argument is a distraction. Saying Jesus existed, was Jewish, taught people, and was crucified does not prove Christianity true. Those are ordinary historical claims. The religion is built on supernatural claims: virgin birth, miracles, resurrection, and Jesus being God. Proving small or normal details does not rescue the wild claims. Spider-Man stories mention New York City, but that does not prove Spider-Man is real. Christianity wants credit for basic history, then quietly smuggles in miracles without equal proof.
So this is what we're looking at. Bart, the skeptic, agrees the Gospels are probably right about all these major claims, all these intermediate claims, and all these lesser claims. And that's quite a lot. I would say that this is enough to judge the Gospels historically reliable until we've seen enough errors to counterbalance this. And so we've got to weigh things. Well, tonight, Bart has proposed a few places in the Gospels where he thinks they contain errors. I don't think they are, and we can talk about that later, but for the sake of argument, let's give him those. I notice that they aren't major claims. He's admitted the major story is right. Instead, they're on some intermediate matters or some lesser matters, but fundamentally, this does not counterbalance this. And so, I conclude, yes, the Gospels are historically reliable. Thank you.
Each of the participants will now have a 10-minute rebuttal. Dr. Bart Ehrman is first.
Well, thank you, Jimmy. I'm glad I'm right about so many things. It's nice to hear. It's been a long time in a debate where I've heard that. So thank you very much. These rebuttals are the hardest part of doing a debate because, we had no idea what each other was going to say. And so, they tend to be a little bit complicated. I want to say a couple of things. Yes, the things Jimmy said that I said are right. I mean, that's right. I mean, I wrote, in addition to the book, Did Jesus Exist? I wrote a book called Jesus, the Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium, many years ago, and I laid out all of these things, and so there's no mystery these things. So, I'm obviously not going to disagree with them. Of course I agree with all of those things. And yet I think the Gospels are not reliable. So what does it mean exactly? I don't think that it's quite right to say that the issues I pointed out are not major claims. If Matthew and Luke they don't agree about the virgin birth, one of them's making stuff up or getting information from somebody who made stuff up, or they both are. And the resurrection, this is not a minor claim. This is a major claim. Jesus' teachings about himself. So I'm only talking about major matters. If you want to talk about lesser matters, I can assure you I can go all night talking about small details, the really lesser matters. Is the genealogy of Jesus a lesser matter? Okay, maybe it's a lesser matter. Why is there a contradiction exactly? So it's an interesting way of kind of sketching it out, that if you get these major things right, then it's reliable. So I was just trying to think while Jimmy was doing that, because I didn't know he was going to be doing it, but it just occurred to me that, suppose I tell you that there's a city, New York City, and it's the biggest city in the United States. It's located in New York State. It has a great theater district. There's a financial district. And so I give like big facts about New York City and say, oh yeah, that's basically reliable. But then I look at my sources, and one of my sources says that Manhattan has 6 million people in it, and another says it has 20 million people in it. One source says it's on the Hudson River, another says it's on the Mississippi River. One says it's 30% African American. Another source says it's 80% African American. One says that the Empire State Building is in Manhattan. Another says it's in Brooklyn. One says the baseball teams are the Mets and the Yankees, and the other said, no, it's the Dodgers and the Angels. One says that it's the headquarters of the CIA. One says that there's only one international airport there. And so, I mean, you could just go down the list, and if we had more than 20 minutes, the list for the gospel would be very, very long indeed. Let me explain how this matters in terms of a big picture. In the Gospel of Mark, we have an account of Jesus' death that is one of the most moving stories in the New Testament. I'm talking about Mark's gospel. The thing is to train yourself to read each of these gospels individually, because Mark has a message for you. And if you pretend that he's saying what John is saying, then you're ignoring Mark's message to you. John has a message for you, and you can't pretend that John's saying the same thing that Luke is saying. Mark's account of Jesus' death is so compelling. Jesus is turned over to the authorities. He goes before Pontius Pilate, and Pontius Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And the only thing Jesus says is, "You say so," in Mark. Su leges, you say so. And he doesn't defend himself. And he's condemned. And so he's taken off to be executed. And he doesn't say anything the entire way. He's silent. And they nail him to the cross, and he's silent in Mark. He's hanging on the cross, and he's silent. Both robbers mock him, and he's silent. People passing by mock him. The Roman soldiers mock him. Everybody mocks him. He's hanging on the cross. He hasn't said anything this entire time, as if he's in shock in Mark's gospel. And at the very end, the only thing he says is, he cries out, at the very end, he cries out, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani." My God, why have you forsaken me? And he dies. Whew. Jesus, at the end, appears to be in shock. He doesn't say anything, and he wonders why God himself has forsaken him. This is a powerful presentation. And the thing is that the reader knows why this is happening, even if Jesus in the story doesn't. Because right when Jesus dies, in Mark's gospel, the second he dies, the curtain in the temple rips in half from top to bottom. And the centurion who's just crucified him says, he sees how he's died, and he says, truly this man was the Son of God. Jesus' death rips the curtain. The curtain is the curtain separating the Holy of Holies, where God himself dwelt, from everyone else. Nobody could go behind the curtain except the high priest would go once a year for the Day of Atonement and make an atonement for his sins, the atonement for the sins of the people once a year. He's the only one who could go in there, could only go in there once a year. But now Jesus has died and everybody has access to God because of his death. But he's in doubt at the end. He doesn't know why it's happening, but you know and God knows that it's bringing salvation, and the centurion recognizes it. The centurion is the only one in this whole gospel who realizes that Jesus has to die even though he's the Son of God. In fact, he's the Son of God because he had to die. But Jesus at the end is in despair. That's Mark. Contrast that with the Gospel of Luke. Luke has a completely different portrayal. In Luke's gospel, Jesus is condemned. He goes out to be crucified, but he's not silent on the way to crucifixion. He sees some women weeping by the side of the road, and he turns to them and he says, daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children, for the fate that's to befall you. There's nothing about him being in shock here. He's worried more about these women than he is. He's going off to be crucified. He's worried about these women. He goes to the place of crucifixion and he's not silent. They nail him to the cross, and he says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And on the cross, he's not silent. He has an intelligent conversation with one of the other people being crucified. One of these criminals starts abusing Jesus, and the other one turns his head to the man and says, don't do this, because we deserve what we're getting, but he hasn't done anything to deserve this. And he turns his head to Jesus and he says, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus says, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. In Luke's gospel, Jesus knows exactly what's happening to him. He knows why it's happening to him, and he knows what's going to happen to him after it happens to him. And at the very end, the most telling thing of all, at the end, Jesus does not cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me? In Luke's gospel, Jesus instead says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And dies. Here Jesus is calm and in control. He understands. There's no agony, no despair. What happens, though, is that people take Mark's gospel and they take Luke's gospel and they smash them together so that Jesus says and does everything that's in Mark and in Luke. And then they throw in Matthew, which is different, and John, which is different, and you end up with a mishmash. You have taken each individual author and you've ignored what he's trying to tell you. You've created your own gospel in your head. You have written the gospel by combining the four, and so you end up with the 7 last words of the dying Jesus. He doesn't say those 7 things in any of the Gospels. He says one here, one here, one here, one here, and each one is having him say these things to make a point, and now you've chosen to ignore his point because you're thinking they're all reliable, so it all happened. I don't think that's the way to read the Gospels. I think when you do that, you're depriving each of these authors of what he has to say. They can't be all right, all correct, unless you smash them together and make each of them say something different from what they actually say. You're ignoring what the message is from each of these. That's the problem. This is not a minor matter. This is not a lesser issue. Each gospel has a different presentation, and if you don't have the differences, you don't have these 4 gospels.
The crucifixion stories show how the gospel writers were shaping theology, not simply reporting history. In Mark, Jesus dies in anguish, crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In Luke, that struggle disappears. Jesus is calm, forgiving people, promising paradise, and confidently giving his spirit to God. Those are completely different portraits of the same moment. Historians see this as evidence that the authors were writing for different religious messages and audiences. When the most important event in Christianity changes depending on which gospel you read, it raises serious questions about how much theology has been mixed into the story. What do you think? If the Gospels give different accounts of Jesus' birth, resurrection, identity, and final moments, can they all be historically reliable at the same time? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future debates and discussions.